Students, I'm going to give you a hint here. This is free. This isn't even part of the sermon. But when you're sitting in class and that professor is waxing eloquent, or at least he thinks he is, and he's talking about something that seems to you completely irrelevant to the subject, do not raise your hand and say, "Is this going to be on the test?" If you get nothing out of the sermon but that, get that. He thinks it's important, and that's why he's saying it. It sort of goes against the teaching profession to ask such questions. Jesus always knew what the right question should be, and so he answers the right question, the question that Peter should have asked with his parable. Jesus' parables are like pieces of coal squeezed into diamonds. They are bright and brilliant in their color, and they throw sparks into our eyes. Jesus' parables are like a door opening on the dimension of God. I love Emily Dickinson's poems. One of her poems begins, "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies." It's the same kind of thing that Paul says when he talks about our seeing through the glass darkly. The truths of God are difficult for our finite minds to grasp. And so Jesus tells his stories. And in those stories we catch glimpses and glimmers of the truths of heaven, the arithmetic of God. The landowner goes early in the morning and hires all of the laborers he can find to go into his vineyard, and he promises to pay each a denarius, and they have agreed to this. 3 hours later, he goes back and hires more laborers, and again at the 6th hour and at the 9th hour. And even at the end of the workday, he goes and he finds more laborers with tools standing there. And he says, "You too go into the field, and I will pay you what is fair." Well, the end of the day comes, and those who worked only for 1 hour come, and they are given a denarius. The ones that began work at the first of the morning are going, "All right, this is great, as we would. Surely we will get proportionately more because of the labor which we did, having borne the heat of the day." But the landholder pays each one of them a denarius as well. And they grumble to him about this, the unfairness of their having worked all day long and gotten a denarius, when the others just came at the very end and got paid the same wage. The math is all wrong. It doesn't make sense. It isn't fair. And the landholder says to them, "Take what belongs to you. If I choose to be generous to these last ones, what is that to you? We made a bargain. I have paid you what I told you I would pay." This isn't just a story from Jesus' imagination. The grape harvest was serious business in Palestine. The grapes ripen toward the end of September, and the rains of October come very soon. And at that moment when the grapes are ready, the landholder must have everyone in the fields that he can possibly get there, for any of the grapes that are left, should the rains come, will be ruined and rot on the vines. This is also serious business for these workers. There's not any Social Security system. There are no food stamps. There's not any unemployment insurance. And what those workers make on that day is what they will have to feed their family that evening. This is the arithmetic of the world. Notice also the issues of security and risk here. The early laborers were certain of their pay. They had a verbal agreement with the landholder that was binding under law. But the later workers only had the word of the landholder that he would be fair with them. They risked his fairness as they worked. They had no security. The quality here is the quality of faith. And this is much the point of the Lord's story, trusting in God's fairness. It is the definition of faith. This leads me to consider three principles which I think this parable holds regarding the mathematics of God. First, there is a reversal of human values. God has His own standards for judging value, and it is different from ours. We judge based on relative worth. What do I get in exchange for this? In short, how many dollars is my effort worth at the end of the day? Our judgment is made in legalistic terms. We want the scales to balance. What shall I get? How much do you owe me? How far am I obliged? But Jesus' arithmetic is based on grace. Everyone is to be saved who comes in faith. Every worker is to be given a livelihood. Every person has dignity. Every social system is to be just. Grace is the opposite of the way the world thinks, however. We put rich over poor every time. We value the powerful over the weak, the educated over the ignorant, the filled over the hungry, the beautiful over the unattractive. And we want to apply the same thing to our justice as well. We want 2 + 2 to add up to 4. The eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth. But try to talk to a mother whose child has been killed in a drive-by shooting that she's gotten a fair and just answer, regardless of the punishment of the criminal. Jesus knew that justice is something less than justice when it isn't something more than justice. Justice without grace is harsh and rigid and inhuman and ultimately self-defeating. And so Jesus turns our value system of justice and right and wrong on its ear. He says things like, "You have heard that it has been said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other to him also." He says things like, "He that would find life must lose it." He smiles and makes jokes and says, "It is harder for a rich man to enter heaven than a camel to pass through the eye of a needle." And of course, in that day, if a man were blessed with wealth, he was obviously blessed by God and would be the very first to enter heaven. The first shall be last, and the last first. The poor and the prostitute and the tax collector are the ones that went to Christ. Who is the greatest? The one who is your servant. A second principle of the math of God is the principle of His generous and liberal gifts. We see a sort of reckless abandonment in the way Jesus loved. He loved like a spendthrift, not like a prudent saver. He threw His love and His compassion around without regard for what anyone would think or say. He loved a Samaritan woman that a good Jew wouldn't even look at. He loved a leper who couldn't come into the temple. He even loved a short little tax collector he found sitting in a tree. By the standards of his day, Jesus was inappropriate in the way He loved. We must be like those later laborers who took a risk on God's fairness, who took a gamble that the landholder would give them what was fair. But I tell you, if we are like the early laborers who are jealous of God's generosity, questioning how readily God gives salvation and forgiveness and grace to those that so obviously to us do not deserve it, then we are so much like that elder brother in the prodigal son parable. It makes us uncomfortable, doesn't it? Our math tells us that there was some justice in that older brother's complaint.